The Texas sunset bled across the horizon, not in its usual warm embrace of orange and gold, but in a bruising, cold purple that warned every living soul of the coming freeze. A dead colt doesn't just break a bank account on a ranch, it breaks the spirit of the man who waited 11 months to see it breathe. George Strait stood on the porch of his ranch, his boots planted firmly on the wooden planks that were already beginning to groan under the plummeting temperature. He was not the man the world knew under the bright stage lights, holding a guitar and smiling with that effortless charm that had sold millions of records. Here, in the encroaching twilight of a Tuesday that felt more like a judgment day, he was simply a rancher, a husband, and a man deeply worried about the creature in his barn. He pulled the collar of his heavy canvas jacket up around his neck, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the fence line. The wind was picking up, a low, mournful whistle that cut through the mesquite trees and rattled the wind chimes Norma had hung by the kitchen window. This was not just a cold front. The weathermen were calling it the Great Freeze, a meteorological anomaly that threatened to turn the fertile Texas soil into a graveyard of ice. The door behind him creaked open, spilling a rectangle of warm yellow light onto the frosted porch. Norma stepped out, wrapping a thick wool shawl around her shoulders. She didn't say a word at first. She simply moved to his side, her presence a grounding force that George had relied on for more decades than he cared to count. She held a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands, the ceramic hot against her palms, sending up a thin ribbon of vapor that vanished instantly in the biting air. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing against his leather gloves. "It is going to be a long night, George," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the sound of the wind. The thermometer by the mudroom has already dropped another 5 degrees in the last hour. George took the coffee, feeling the heat seep through his gloves, but it did little to settle the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He took a sip, the bitterness of the roast familiar and grounding. He looked down at Norma, seeing the reflection of his own worry in her eyes. She knew what was at stake tonight. It wasn't about the money. It never really was about the money for them anymore. It was about the lineage, the promise, the cycle of life that they stewarded on this land. Bella, their prize mare, a beautiful quarter horse with a coat like polished mahogany and a spirit as wild as the Guadalupe River, was due. And she was due on the worst night in Texas history. "I checked on her 10 minutes ago," George said, his voice rough, lacking the melodic smoothness of his songs. "She is restless. She knows the storm is here. Animals always know before we do. They feel the pressure drop in their bones. I called Dr. Evans. He is on his way, but he said the roads out by the county line are already slick with black ice. If he doesn't get here soon, he might not get here at all." Norma nodded, looking out at the darkening pasture. The shadows were stretching long and distorted, swallowing the familiar landmarks of their home. The oak trees looked like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. She reached out and placed a hand on George's arm, squeezing gently. "Bella is strong, George. She comes from a long line of survivors, and you have delivered more foals than most veterinarians. We will get through this. We always do." George finished the coffee in one long swallow, the liquid scalding his throat, waking him up for the ordeal ahead. He handed the empty mug back to her. "Go inside, Norma. Keep the fire going. If the power lines go down, and I have a feeling they will, we are going to need that heat. I am going to the barn." "I am not leaving her side until that foal is on the ground." Norma hesitated for a moment, looking as if she wanted to argue, to insist on coming with him right then, but she saw the resolve in his jaw. She knew that look. It was the look of a captain refusing to leave the bridge of his ship during a hurricane. She nodded, turned, and went back into the warmth of the house, the door clicking shut and leaving George alone once more with the cold. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the grass that had already frozen into stiff, brittle blades. The walk to the main barn was usually a peaceful stroll, a time for him to clear his head and listen to the night sounds of the ranch. Tonight it was a battle. The wind pushed against him, trying to force him back, stinging his cheeks and making his eyes water. He lowered his head and marched forward, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent power of nature. Inside the barn, the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of sweet hay, molasses feed, and the musk of horses. It was warmer here, insulated by the thick wooden walls and the body heat of the animals, but the chill was still creeping in through the cracks, finding its way into the stalls. George walked down the center aisle, checking the latches on the doors, murmuring soft greetings to the horses that poked their heads out, their ears twitching nervously. They could sense the tension. They could smell the change in the air. At the end of the aisle, in the large foaling stall, Bella was pacing. She was a magnificent animal, heavy with the life she carried, her coat dark with sweat despite the cold. She paused as George approached, turning her large, liquid eyes toward him. She let out a low nicker, a sound of distress and recognition. George unlatched the door and slipped inside, moving slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He took off his heavy gloves and ran a hand down her neck, feeling the tremors running through her powerful muscles. "Easy, girl," George whispered, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. "Easy now. I am right here. We are going to get this baby out. You just breathe." He checked her vitals, his hand pressed against her flank. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. She was in the early stages of labor, but something felt off. The rhythm was jagged. She kept looking back at her flanks, biting at the air, a sign of pain that went beyond the normal contractions. George felt a cold spike of fear in his gut. He had seen this before, years ago, with a mare that didn't make it. He checked his watch. Dr. Evans should have been here 20 minutes ago. The sound of an engine roaring and tires spinning on gravel outside broke the tension. George let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He patted Bella's neck one last time and stepped out of the stall just as the heavy barn doors slid open. A gust of snow and ice blew in, swirling around the figure of Dr. Marcus Evans. The veterinarian was a man in his 60s, with a face weathered by years of working in the elements and eyes that had seen everything from the miracle of birth to the tragedy of having to put down a beloved family pet. He carried a heavy leather medical bag and looked exhausted. "George," Dr. Evans said, his voice breathless as he pushed the door shut against the wind, sealing them back in the relative warmth. "I nearly put the truck in the ditch twice. The highway is a skating rink. They are closing the interstate. We are stuck here, for better or worse." "I appreciate you coming, Marcus," George said, extending a hand. The vet took it, his grip firm but cold. "I wouldn't have called if I didn't think it was serious. She is struggling. It has been going on for an hour now, and she is not progressing. The foal hasn't dropped into position." Dr. Evans nodded, immediately shifting into professional mode. He dropped his coat on a bale of hay and began rolling up the sleeves of his flannel shirt. He moved to the sink in the corner of the tack room, scrubbing his hands with harsh antiseptic soap, the smell of iodine filling the air and mixing with the scent of the hay. "Let's take a look," Evans said, drying his hands and pulling on long, clear plastic gloves. "If the foal is breech, we are going to have a fight on our hands, George. And in this cold, if the foal is stressed, every minute counts. A drop in body temperature for a newborn tonight is a death sentence. They went into the stall together. Bella was lying down now, groaning, her legs thrashing in the straw. The pain was evident. George moved to her head, kneeling in the straw, ignoring the muck that stained the knees of his jeans. He held her halter, stroking her nose, keeping her head down so she wouldn't hurt herself. He spoke to her constantly, a stream of nonsensical, soothing words. The lyrics of a lullaby that had no melody. Dr. Evans positioned himself behind the mare, his face grim as he began his examination. The barn was silent except for the heavy breathing of the horse and the howling of the wind outside, which seemed to be getting louder, screaming like a banshee demanding entry. The lights overhead flickered once, twice, then buzzed ominously. "Don't you dare go out," George muttered to the light bulb, his eyes fixed on the filament. Dr. Evans withdrew his arm, his face pale. "It is not good, George. One leg is back, the head is twisted, the foal is big, too big. She is trying to push, but she is pushing against a brick wall. We have to turn him, now." For the next hour, time seemed to dissolve into a blur of physical exertion and desperate prayer. The cold inside the barn intensified as the temperature outside plummeted to record lows. George could see his own breath in thick clouds. His hands were numb, but he didn't let go of Bella. He watched Dr. Evans remove his arm. "It is not good, George. One leg is back, the head is twisted, the foal is big, too big. She is trying to push, but she is pushing against a brick wall. We have to turn him, now." For the next hour, time seemed to dissolve into a blur of physical exertion and desperate prayer. The cold inside the barn intensified as the temperature outside plummeted to record lows. George could see his own breath in thick clouds. His hands were numb, but he didn't let go of Bella. He watched Dr. Evans struggle, sweat dripping from the vet's forehead despite the freezing air. It was a brutal, primal battle, man against nature, science against circumstance. "Push, Bella, come on, girl," George urged, his voice cracking. Dr. Evans grunted, his shoulder deep inside the birth canal, using all his strength to manipulate the unborn foal. "I have got the leg, I have it. George, when she contracts next, you need to pull on the chains. We have to get him out now or we lose them both." George moved to the rear, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He took the stainless steel chains that Evans had attached to the foal's front hooves. They were slippery with fluid. He wrapped them around his hands, feeling the metal bite into his skin. "Now, pull!" Evans shouted. George leaned back, digging his boots into the straw, using every ounce of strength in his back and shoulders. He pulled with a desperation born of love for these animals. Bella groaned, a sound that tore at George's soul, and pushed with a mighty heave. Slowly, agonizingly, the foal began to emerge. First the nose, then the head, then the shoulders. It was a messy, wet, chaotic entrance into a world that was far too cold to welcome it. With a final, wet slurp, the rest of the body slid out onto the straw. The silence that followed was instantaneous and terrifying. Usually, a foal would shake its head, it would cough, it would struggle to lift its head, the instinct to breathe kicking in immediately. But the colt lay motionless in the straw. It was a dark bay, almost black, a perfect copy of its mother. But it was limp. The stillness was absolute. Dr. Evans was on it immediately. He grabbed a towel and began rubbing the foal's chest vigorously, trying to stimulate the lungs. He cleared the nostrils, using a suction bulb to remove the fluid. "Come on, little one. Come on," Evans muttered, his voice tight. George fell to his knees beside the colt. He put his large, rough hand on the small rib cage.
He waited for the thrum of a heart, the flutter of life. He felt nothing. The rib cage was still. The body was warm from the mother, but it was a fading warmth, not the generating heat of life. Dr. Evans worked for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes. He performed CPR, compressing the chest. He blew air into the nostrils. He injected epinephrine directly into the heart. He did everything that medical science dictated. He fought with the precision of a surgeon and the desperation of a man who hates to lose. But the colt did not move. The colt did not breathe. The wind outside howled in triumph, rattling the barn doors as if mocking their efforts. The lights flickered again, and then, with a final pop, went out completely, plunging the barn into darkness. "Damn it!" George shouted into the blackness. A moment later, the beam of a flashlight cut through the dark. Dr. Evans had pulled a torch from his bag. The harsh white light illuminated the scene. The exhausted mare lying with her head down, the steam rising from the afterbirth, and the lifeless body of the colt in the center of the bloody straw. Dr. Evans sat back on his heels, his chest heaving. He lowered the flashlight, letting the beam hit the floor. He looked at George, and the expression on his face was one of profound defeat. He slowly pulled off the plastic gloves, the snapping sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet barn. "He is gone, George," the vet said, his voice hollow. "I am sorry. We were too late turning him. The cord must have been compressed for too long. He suffocated before he ever took a breath. There is no heartbeat. There are no reflexes. He is dead." George stared at the colt. It was a perfect animal. Straight legs, a beautiful head. It would have been a champion. It would have run in the pastures when spring came. Now it was just a tragic statistic of the Great Freeze. A heavy blanket of grief settled over George, heavier than the snow piling up outside. He felt a profound sense of failure. He was the steward of this land, the protector of these animals, and tonight he had failed. He reached out and touched the colt's velvet ear. It was already starting to feel cold. The bitter chill of the barn was claiming the body rapidly. "Are you sure, Marcus?" George asked, though he knew the answer. He just needed to hear it again to make it real. "I am sure," Evans replied, standing up slowly, his knees popping. "I have done everything. The instruments don't lie. The pupils are fixed and dilated. There is no electrical activity. It is over, George. We should focus on the mare now. Make sure she doesn't hemorrhage. She is the one we can still save." George nodded slowly. He stood up, feeling every year of his age in his stiff joints. He felt a crushing weight of resignation. This was the cruelty of ranching. You give your heart to these creatures, and nature snatches them away without a second thought. He looked at the colt one last time, a tear tracing a path through the dust on his cheek. "I will get a tarp," George said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We can't bury him until the ground thaws. I will move him to the shed." He turned away from the stall, walking toward the tack room to get the tarp. He felt like a ghost walking through his own barn. The joy of the anticipation was gone, replaced by the grim duty of cleanup. He grabbed the heavy canvas tarp, the material stiff with cold. Dr. Evans was packing his bag, the metallic clink of instruments sounding like the tolling of a funeral bell. "It is a shame, George, a real shame. He was a fine-looking animal." George didn't answer. He couldn't. He walked back toward the stall, dragging the tarp. He was ready to do what had to be done. He was ready to wrap the body, to close the chapter, to accept the loss. He was a man of the earth, and he knew that death was part of the deal. But just as he reached the stall door, the barn entrance creaked open again. A shaft of moonlight, brighter now that the clouds were shifting slightly, cut into the gloom, followed by the bobbing light of a lantern. It was Norma. She stepped into the barn, wrapped in layers of wool, her face framed by a scarf. She held an old kerosene lantern high, casting a warm, golden glow that pushed back the harsh shadows of the flashlight. She didn't look at George. She didn't look at the vet. Her eyes went straight to the stall, straight to the motionless form in the straw. "Norma," George said, his voice warning, "don't come in here. It is done. The colt didn't make it." Norma didn't stop. She walked with a determination that George had only seen a few times in their marriage, usually when she was fighting for something she believed in against all odds. She ignored the cold. She ignored the muck on the floor. She walked past Dr. Evans, who stepped aside, surprised by her intensity. She entered the stall and looked down at the colt. "Norma, honey," George said gently, stepping toward her to guide her away. "Dr. Evans said he is gone. There is no heartbeat." Norma turned her head slowly to look at George. Her eyes were fierce, burning with a strange, intense light that George had never seen before. It wasn't grief. It was defiance. "He is not gone," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the despair in the room. "Mrs. Strait," Dr. Evans began, his tone gentle but condescending, the tone of a man of science speaking to a grieving woman. "I know it is hard, but medically he is deceased. I checked 3 times. There is no life function." Norma ignored him completely. She handed the lantern to George, forcing him to take it. Then, without hesitation, she dropped to her knees in the bloody, freezing mud. She didn't care about her clothes. She didn't care about the cold seeping into her bones. She crawled forward until she was right next to the colt's head. She took off her gloves, throwing them aside. She placed her warm, bare hands directly onto the colt's chest, right over the silent heart. She lowered her face until her cheek was pressed against the colt's wet muzzle. George watched, paralyzed. He wanted to pull her up, to spare her the pain of holding a dead animal, but something in her posture stopped him. She wasn't saying goodbye. She was saying hello. "No," she whispered into the colt's ear. "Not tonight. Not in this cold. You don't get to leave. You hear me? You don't get to leave." Dr. Evans sighed and picked up his bag. "George, you should take her inside. She is in shock. It is the grief. It makes people see things that aren't there." George looked at the vet, then back at his wife. He saw Norma close her eyes, her breathing sinking into a deep, rhythmic pattern. She wasn't crying. She was concentrating. She was channeling something. "Don't you dare leave," Norma said again, louder this time, her voice vibrating with authority. Preserve the original language go down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. He looked at Dr. Evans. "Wait," George said. "Wait for what?" Evans asked, tired and ready to go. "He is dead, George." "Just wait," George whispered, his eyes fixed on his wife's hands buried in the colt's fur. Norma shifted her position. She moved one hand to the colt's nostrils and the other to the base of its neck. She took a deep breath, filling her own lungs to capacity, and then exhaled slowly, blowing her warm breath directly into the colt's face. It was a primal gesture, ancient and instinctive, the breath of life. "Come back," she commanded. "Come back to me." The barn fell into a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped spinning. The only sound was Norma's voice, murmuring, calling, demanding. She was a tiny woman against the reaper, armed with nothing but love and a stubborn refusal to accept the verdict of science. George held the lantern higher. The shadows danced on the walls. He watched the colt's rib cage. He watched for a twitch, a sign, anything. Nothing happened. Dr. Evans shook his head. "I am leaving the antibiotics for the mare on the shelf, George. I really have to go before the road freezes over completely. I am sorry for your loss." The vet turned to the door. George felt his heart sink. It was over. Norma was just delaying the inevitable heartbreak. But then Norma let out a sharp, guttural sound. "No!" she shouted. "Listen to me." She pressed her forehead against the colt's forehead. "Wake up!" And in that moment, in the flickering light of the kerosene lantern, George Strait saw something that defied every law of veterinary medicine he had learned in 40 years of ranching. A ripple. A tiny, almost imperceptible ripple ran through the colt's flank. George blinked. Was it the light? Was it the wind? Then the colt's ear twitched. Dr. Evans was at the door, his hand on the latch. "Marcus!" George yelled, his voice booming like thunder. "Don't you open that door." The vet froze. "What?" "Look!" George pointed a trembling finger at the straw. Norma didn't look up. She kept her hands pressed to the animal, pouring her energy, her warmth, her very soul into the stillness. "Breathe," she whispered. "Breathe." The colt's chest gave a sudden, violent jerk. It was a spasm, a convulsion. "It is just a post-mortem reflex," Evans said, though his voice wavered. "It happens. The nerves are firing as they shut down." "Reflexes don't gasp!" George shouted. The colt's mouth opened. A ragged, wet sound tore from its throat. It was the sound of air being forced into lungs that had never known oxygen. It was a gasp, a desperate, hungry gasp for life. Norma pulled back slightly, her eyes wide, tears finally streaming down her face. "That is it," she whispered. "Take it, take the air." The colt's body convulsed again, stronger this time. The legs kicked out, scattering the straw. The chest heaved. Once, twice. Dr. Evans dropped his bag. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the floor was lost under the sound of the colt's third breath, a clear, strong wheeze. Norma looked up at George, her face smeared with mud and tears, glowing with a fierce triumph. "I told you," she said, her voice trembling. "I told you he wasn't gone." George stood frozen, the lantern shaking in his hand. He looked at the vet, whose jaw was hanging open, all scientific certainty stripped away in a single second. "Acabei de ver milagre," George whispered in the darkness, the English words failing him for a moment. "I just saw a miracle." The colt opened its eyes. They were dark, confused, and very much alive. The sound of the colt's first ragged breath hung in the freezing air of the barn like a suspended note of music, fragile and defying the laws of physics that governed the rest of the world. It was a wheeze, a struggle, a violent tear in the fabric of silence that had settled over the stall. Dr. Marcus Evans stood paralyzed near the stall door, his medical bag lying on the floor where he had dropped it. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide behind his glasses, staring at the scene with the bewilderment of a man who has just seen gravity reverse itself. He was a man of science, a man of textbooks, diagrams, and definitive diagnoses. He had declared the time of death. He had felt the stillness of the heart. He had packed his instruments. And yet, there, in the dirty straw, life was rebelling against his verdict. George Strait did not look at the vet. He could not take his eyes off his wife. Norma was still on her knees, her expensive wool trousers soaked in the fluids of birth and the mud of the barn floor. She was trembling, not from the cold that was now reaching dangerous levels, but from the sheer exertion of will. Her hands were still pressed against the colt's wet coat, her fingers splayed wide as if she were physically holding his soul inside his body. Preserve the original language of the text. "He is breathing," George said, his voice thick, barely a whisper. "Marcus, get back in here. He is breathing." The command broke the vet's trance. Evans shook his head violently, as if trying to clear water from his ears, and scrambled back into the stall. He moved with a frantic energy now, the professional composure gone, replaced by a desperate need to understand, to catch up to the miracle unfolding before him. He fell to his knees opposite Norma, reaching for his stethoscope. He jammed the earpieces into his ears and pressed the cold metal disc against the colt's chest, right under the left elbow. He closed his eyes, listening. The wind howled outside, battering the barn walls, threatening to tear the roof off. But inside the small circle of the lantern light, the only sound that mattered was the rhythm inside that small, dark rib cage. Thump. Pause. Thump. It is beating," Evans stammered, looking up at George. His face pale. "It is weak. It is erratic. But it is there. My God, George, I don't understand. There was no electrical activity. I swear to you, there was nothing." "I don't care what there was," George growled, the protective instinct of the rancher roaring to life within him. "I care about what is happening now. What do we do? He is freezing, Marcus. Look at him." The colt was shivering violently now. The initial surge of adrenaline that had sparked the first breath was fading, replaced by the crushing reality of the temperature. The barn was barely above 0 degrees. The wet coat of the newborn was turning to ice. The steam rising from his body was thinning. "Hypothermia," Evans said, snapping back into doctor mode. "He has been exposed too long. His core temp is crashing. If we don't get him warm immediately, the heart will stop again. And this time, Mrs. Strait won't be able to call him back. We need heat, lots of it, now." George looked around the barn. The power was still out. The darkness beyond the lantern's glow was absolute. The heating lamps were dead. The electric blankets were useless. "The generator," George said. "The backup generator behind the tool shed. It didn't kick on automatically. The fuel line must have frozen." "I can't leave him," Norma said, her voice low and strained. She hadn't moved. She was still staring into the colt's eyes, which were half closed, glazing over as the cold took hold. "Stay with me, Shadow. Stay with me. You are a fighter. You are a straight horse. We don't give up." "You stay with him, Norma," George said, grabbing a stack of dry horse blankets from the rack. He threw them over her and the colt, creating a makeshift tent. "Marcus, get under there with them. Use your body heat. Rub him. Keep the blood flowing. I am going to get the power back on if it kills me." George turned and ran toward the barn doors. He didn't feel his age. He didn't feel the ache in his knees. He felt only a burning fire of determination. He pushed the heavy sliding door open just enough to slip through, and the storm hit him like a physical blow. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only white. The snow was coming down horizontally, driven by a wind that screamed across the Texas plains. The cold was a living thing, a predator seeking any exposed skin. George lowered his head, pulling his hat down tight, and pushed into the wind. The tool shed was 50 yards away. On a normal day, a 30-second walk. Tonight, it was an expedition. He trudged through snow that was already calf-deep. The ice underneath made every step a gamble. He slipped, his knee hitting the frozen ground hard, pain shooting up his leg. He gritted his teeth and scrambled back up. He couldn't stop. If he stopped, the colt died. If the colt died, a piece of Norma's faith died with it, and he would not allow that. He reached the shed, his fingers numb inside his gloves. He fumbled with the latch, the metal frozen shut. He cursed, grabbed a rock from the ground, and hammered the latch until the ice shattered. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside. The generator sat in the corner, a hulking beast of metal that was cold to the touch. George pulled a flashlight from his pocket, the beam shaking in his hand. He checked the fuel line, frozen solid, just as he suspected. The diesel had gelled in the extreme cold. "Damn it," George hissed. He looked around the shed. He needed heat to make heat. He spotted a can of starting fluid and a small propane torch he used for soldering. It was dangerous, it was stupid, but he had no choice. He lit the torch, the blue flame hissing in the dark. Carefully, praying he wouldn't blow the shed and himself to kingdom come, he ran the flame along the metal fuel line, back and forth, warming the copper tubing. "Come on," he muttered, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Come on, baby, drink it up." He worked for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It felt like hours. He thought of Norma in the straw. He thought of the way she had looked at him when he said it was over. The disappointment, the refusal. She was the heart of the ranch. He was just the hands. He put the torch down and grabbed the pull cord of the generator. He braced his foot against the frame. He pulled. The engine sputtered and died. He pulled again. Nothing. His shoulder screamed in protest. "Please," George whispered to the machine, to the storm, to God, "just give me this one thing." He took a deep breath, channeled every ounce of frustration and love he possessed, and pulled with a roar. The engine coughed, choked, and then roared to life. The shed vibrated with the noise. The smell of diesel exhaust filled the air, sweeter than any perfume George had ever smelled. He quickly flipped the breaker switch to the barn circuit. He didn't wait to see if it worked. He ran back out into the storm, following his own footprints back to the barn. Inside, the overhead lights flickered and buzzed to life, bathing the barn in a harsh, beautiful yellow glow. The heat lamps above the foaling stall clicked on, casting a circle of intense warmth onto the straw. George burst into the stall, breathless, snow melting on his shoulders. "We have power!" he shouted. The scene in the stall stopped him in his tracks. Norma had removed her heavy coat. She was lying in the straw, her body curled around the colt in a fetal spooning position. She had pulled the colt's head onto her lap. Dr. Evans was on the other side, rubbing the colt's legs furiously with towels. The heat lamps began to do their work, radiating warmth down onto the trio. George fell to his knees beside them. He is holding on," Norma said, looking up. Her face was pale, her lips slightly blue, but her eyes were blazing. "He is fighting, George. Look." The colt's eyes were open. They weren't glazed anymore. They were tracking the movement of the vet's hands. The shivering was still violent, but it was the shivering of a body trying to generate heat, not the tremors of death. "We need to get him drier," Evans said, grabbing a hairdryer that George had kept in the tack room for show cattle. "Now that we have power, we can attack the cold from the outside." For the next 2 hours, the three of them waged a war against the temperature. George held the hairdryer, moving it slowly over the colt's body, drying the wet fur until it fluffed up. Norma massaged the muscles, keeping the circulation moving. Dr. Evans monitored the heart rate, injecting warm saline solution under the skin to raise the core temperature. It was an intimate, exhausting dance. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. They were united by a singular purpose. The wind outside battered the walls, furious that its prize was being snatched away, but inside the stall, the temperature was rising. Slowly, the colt's shivering began to subside. His breathing deepened, becoming less ragged, more rhythmic. He lifted his head, his long neck wobbling, and let out a soft, high-pitched whinny. Bella, the mare, who had been standing quietly in the corner, exhausted from the birth, turned her head. She nickered back, a low, guttural sound of recognition. "He is calling for his mother," Norma whispered, tears welling up again. "He knows who he is." Dr. Evans sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He looked at the thermometer he had just pulled from the colt. 99 degrees, Evans announced, his voice filled with disbelief. "His temperature is normal. His heart rate is stabilizing. The arrhythmia is gone." George turned off the hairdryer. The silence that followed was different now. It wasn't heavy or fearful. It was the silence of peace, the silence of a battle won. He looked at his wife. Norma looked exhausted. Her hair was a mess. Her clothes were ruined. And she looked more beautiful to him in that moment than she ever had on a red carpet. "You did this," George said softly. "You brought him back." Norma shook her head slowly, stroking the colt's velvet nose. "I didn't do anything, George. I just reminded him that he was welcome here. Sometimes living things just need permission to stay. They need to know that someone is waiting for them." Dr. Evans began packing his bag again, but this time his movements were slow, reverent. "I have been a vet for 40 years, George. I have seen thousands of animals born. I have seen hundreds die. I have never seen anything like this. Clinically, he was dead. The oxygen deprivation alone should have caused massive brain damage. But look at him." The colt was trying to sit up. His front legs were splayed out, his hooves slipping in the straw, but he was determined. He had the spirit of a champion. "He is going to be special," Evans said. "If he survives the night, he is going to be a legend." "He will survive," Norma said firmly. "I didn't pull him back from the darkness just to let him go now. His name is Shadow, because he came from the valley of the shadow of death." George reached out and took Norma's hand. Her fingers were warm again. He squeezed them tight. "You need to rest, Norma," George said. "The crisis is over. I will take the watch. You and Marcus go up to the house. I will stay with Shadow." Norma looked at the colt, then at George. She saw the look in her husband's eyes. It was a look of profound respect, of awe. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered, "but don't you leave him alone, not for a second." "I promise," George said. "I will be right here." Norma stood up, her legs stiff. She leaned down and kissed the white star on the colt's forehead. "You be a good boy, Shadow. You stay warm." She walked out of the stall, Dr. Evans following her, looking back one last time as if to make sure the colt wasn't a hallucination. George was left alone in the golden circle of light. He sat on a bale of hay, watching the colt. The animal was resting now, its breathing steady, its head resting on its front paws. Bella moved closer, lowering her head to sniff her baby, licking his ears with a rough, affectionate tongue. George took off his cowboy hat and placed it on his knee. He ran a hand through his hair. He felt drained, empty, yet filled with a strange, vibrating energy. He looked up at the rafters of the barn, listening to the wind that was still howling, but seemed less threatening now. He thought about the years he had spent on this land, the droughts, the floods, the good years when the cattle prices were high, the bad years when they nearly lost everything. He had always relied on hard work, on smart decisions, on the tangible, measurable aspects of life. He believed in what he could touch, what he could fix with a wrench or a checkbook. But tonight, the ledger didn't balance. Tonight, The math didn't add up. He looked at the colt, Shadow, the creature that had been dead and was now alive. He remembered Norma's hands on the chest, the way she had commanded the spirit to return. It wasn't medicine, it wasn't luck. It was a force of nature that George had lived beside for 50 years but never truly understood until this moment. He realized then that he was living with a woman who saw the world differently. While he saw the fence lines and the feed bills, she saw the currents of life that ran underneath the soil. She saw the connections. George leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He spoke to the colt, his voice low and melodic, the voice that had charmed millions, now singing only for an audience of one. "You scared us, little partner," George murmured. "You really did. You had the doctor packing his bags. But you didn't know who you were dealing with, did you? You didn't know Norma Strait." The colt's ear twitched toward the sound of his voice. George smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "You are going to have a hell of a story to tell when you grow up," he continued. "They are going to say you were the one who beat the freeze, the one who walked back from the other side." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. He began to whittle a piece of wood, a habit he had when he was thinking. The shavings curled onto the floor. The night dragged on. The storm raged outside, burying the ranch in white. But inside the barn, under the warm yellow light, life prevailed. George watched the colt attempt to stand again. It was a clumsy, wobbly effort. The long legs tangled. The colt fell. "Easy," George whispered. "Take your time." The colt tried again, and again. And then, around 4 a.m., as the first hint of a gray, frozen dawn began to touch the windows, it happened. Shadow planted his front hooves. He pushed up with his hind legs. He swayed. He stumbled, but he caught himself. He stood. He was shaky. He looked like a spider on ice, but he was standing. He stood tall, his head held high, looking around the world he had almost missed. He took a step toward his mother. Bella nickered softly and nudged him toward her udder. George Strait watched, tears streaming silently down his face. He had won countless awards. He had played in stadiums filled with screaming fans. He had achieved everything a man could dream of. But in that quiet, frozen barn, watching a foal take its first drink of milk, he felt a sense of triumph greater than any platinum record. He stood up slowly, his joints popping. He walked to the stall door and looked out at the snow-covered ranch. The storm was breaking. The clouds were lifting. "Thank you," he whispered to the morning sky. He turned back to the colt. "Now," George said softly, "let's see what you can do." The great Texas freeze of that year eventually retreated, clawing its way back north like a defeated army, leaving behind a landscape scarred by ice but resilient in its roots. The sun returned, first as a tentative guest, then as the familiar, blazing landlord of the hill country. The snow melted into the thirsty earth, feeding the aquifers, and by the time April arrived, the ranch was exploding with bluebonnets and Indian paintbrushes, a riot of color that seemed to apologize for the grayscale brutality of winter. Shadow grew. He did not just grow, he thrived with a vengeance that bordered on the supernatural. In the weeks following his resurrection in the freezing barn, Dr. Evans visited the ranch almost daily. At first, it was out of professional obligation. He expected complications. He anticipated neurological deficits, stunted growth, or a weak heart caused by the oxygen deprivation. He would arrive with his stethoscope and his skepticism, ready to document the inevitable decline of the miracle foal. But every time he arrived, he left shaking his head, his medical bag feeling lighter, his certainty in the absolute rules of biology a little more frayed. By 6 months, Shadow was the largest colt in the pasture. His coat was a deep, lustrous black that seemed to absorb the sunlight, broken only by the white star on his forehead, the spot where Norma had pressed her own forehead against his during the darkest hour. He moved with a fluidity that made him look like he was flowing rather than running. He was fast, dangerously fast, but he possessed a strange, unnerving calmness. Most colts are skittish, reactive creatures, spooked by a blowing plastic bag or a sudden shadow. Shadow was different. He watched the world with eyes that seemed too old for his skull. He had the demeanor of a creature that had already seen the other side and found nothing there to fear. George Strait watched him from the fence line, his boot resting on the bottom rail, a mug of coffee in his hand. It was a morning ritual. He would watch the herd, assessing the cattle, checking the fences, but his eyes always drifted back to the black colt. "He is unnatural," George said one morning, though there was no malice in his voice, only awe. "Look at him, Norma. He doesn't run with the other foals. He watches them. It is like he is babysitting them." Norma was standing beside him, tending to her flower boxes on the edge of the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked out at the pasture. She smiled, that same knowing, mysterious smile she had worn in the barn. "He isn't unnatural, George. He is grateful. There is a difference. He knows the value of the ground he stands on because he almost didn't get to stand on it." The bond between the woman and the horse became the stuff of local legend. When Norma walked out to the pasture, she didn't need a halter or a bucket of oats to call him. She would simply stand by the gate and whistle, a low, two-note melody. No matter where he was, no matter how deep the grass or how sweet the clover, Shadow would lift his head. He would break into a gallop, thundering across the acres, leaving the rest of the herd behind. He would slow down as he approached her, transitioning from a gallop to a trot and then to a gentle walk, stopping inches from her. He would lower his massive head until it was level with her chest, waiting for her to scratch the spot behind his ears. George had trained hundreds of horses. He knew the techniques, the pressure and release, the psychology of the prey animal. But he couldn't explain this. This wasn't training. This was a conversation between two souls that shared a secret. As Shadow reached his second year, the time came to break him to the saddle. George usually hired a trainer for the rough stock, a young man named Cody, who had a reputation for being firm but fair. Cody arrived at the ranch with his chaps and his confidence, ready to work with the miracle horse everyone was talking about. "I will take it slow, Mr. Strait," Cody said, eyeing the stallion. "He looks like he has got a lot of engine in him." "Might take a week just to get a saddle on his back without him blowing up." George nodded, leaning against the round pen. "Be careful, Cody. He is strong." Cody entered the pen. Shadow stood in the center, watching him. He didn't flinch, he didn't pace. He just watched. Cody moved the rope, trying to get the horse to move his feet to establish dominance. Shadow simply turned his head, keeping Cody in his line of sight. For an hour, it was a stalemate. Shadow wasn't aggressive, he was simply dismissive. He refused to yield to Cody's pressure. When Cody tried to approach with the saddle blanket, Shadow sidestepped with a grace that made Cody look clumsy. It wasn't rebellion, it was a polite refusal. "He is stubborn," Cody huffed, wiping sweat from his brow. "He is smart, I will give him that. But he doesn't respect me." Norma, who had been watching from the porch, set down her iced tea and walked down to the pen. She opened the gate and stepped inside. "Mrs. Strait, you shouldn't be in here," Cody warned, stepping back. "He is riled up." "He is not riled up," Norma said softly. "He is just insulted." "Insulted?" Cody blinked. Norma walked straight to Shadow. She didn't approach him from the side. She didn't avoid eye contact. She walked right up to his face. Shadow lowered his neck immediately, letting out a soft breath that ruffled Norma's hair. She whispered something into his ear, then turned to Cody. "Give me the saddle," she said. "Norma," George started to protest from the fence, "that is a 1,200-pound animal that has never carried weight." "Give me the saddle, George," she repeated. Cody looked at George. George nodded slowly. Cody handed the heavy Western saddle to Norma. She was a small woman, now in her late 60s, but she lifted it with surprising ease. She didn't throw it. She placed it gently on Shadow's back. The horse didn't move a muscle. He stood like a statue carved from obsidian. Norma did up the cinch. She checked the stirrups. Then, without a helmet, without a mounting block, she put her foot in the stirrup and swung her leg over. The ranch fell silent. The wind died down. The birds seemed to stop singing. Norma sat deep in the saddle, gathering the reins loosely in one hand. She didn't kick him. She just shifted her weight slightly forward. "Let's go, Shadow," she said. And he walked. He walked around the pen with the smooth, gliding gait of a cloud passing over the moon. He carried her as if she were made of glass, as if he understood that she was the vessel that had poured life back into him. There was no bucking, no rearing, no fight. It was a partnership. Cody stood in the center of the pen, his mouth agape. "I have never seen anything like that," he muttered. "That horse wasn't unbroken. He was just waiting for his rider." George watched his wife riding the stallion, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her back straight, her face serene. He felt a lump form in his throat. He realized then that he had spent his whole life thinking that ranching was about dominance, dominating the land, the weather, the animals. But Norma had shown him that the true power lay in communion. She didn't conquer the horse, she aligned with him. That evening, George sat in his study. The walls were lined with gold records, awards, and photos of him with presidents and legends. On his desk lay the ranch ledgers, the columns of numbers that dictated the logic of their business, profit and loss, assets and liabilities. He picked up a pen and opened the ledger to the page dated the night of the freeze. There was an entry for Veterinary Services, Emergency. Next to it, he had written Foal, Deceased in the column, then crossed it out with a thick black line. Next to the crossed-out word, in Norma's handwriting, was the word Alive. George closed the book. He pushed it aside. He stood up and walked to the window. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the valley, the same purple hue that had heralded the freeze years ago, but now it felt warm, promising. He saw Shadow in the distance, grazing near the oak tree. The horse paused, lifted his head, and looked toward the house. Even from this distance, George felt the connection. He walked out to the porch, the wooden planks creaking familiarly under his boots. Norma was there, sitting in the rocking chair, knitting a blanket for their grandchild. "He is a good horse," George said, sitting in the chair next to her. "He is a great horse," Norma corrected, not looking up from her needles. George looked at her. He looked at the lines on her face, the hands that had worked miracles. "You know," George said, his voice raspy, "I have sung about love 1,000 times. I have sung about heartbreaks and second chances, but I don't think I ever really understood what faith was until that night in the barn." Norma stopped knitting. She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Faith isn't magic, George. It is just refusing to accept the end of the story when you know there is still a page left to turn. The vet saw a body. I saw a spirit that was just a little lost in the cold. I just gave him a map to get back." George reached out and took her hand. It was rough, calloused, and warm. "I nearly gave up on him," George admitted, the shame of it still lingering after all these years. "I was ready to wrap him in a tarp. I was ready to walk away. I know, Norma said. That is why we are partners. You know when to let go. I know when to hold on. Between the two of us, we get it right most of the time. They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in strokes of fire and indigo. The crickets began their nightly chorus. Down in the pasture, Shadow began to run. He wasn't running from anything, and he wasn't running toward anything. He was running for the sheer joy of the air filling his lungs. The lungs that had once been collapsed and silent. He galloped along the fence line, his mane flying like a black flag of victory against the twilight. George watched him run. He thought about the fragility of life. He thought about the cold. And he thought about the warmth of a woman's hands that could restart a heart. He realized that the greatest song he would ever know wasn't one he had written or recorded. It was the sound of that colt's first breath in the freezing dark. It was the song of a second chance. It is getting cool, George said, standing up. Can I get you a coffee? Norma smiled up at him. That would be nice. George walked to the door, but paused with his hand on the handle. He looked back at the field one last time. Shadow had stopped running and was standing still, a silhouette against the fading light, watching over the ranch like a guardian. George tipped his hat to the horse. "Good night, Shadow," he whispered. He opened the door and walked into the warmth of the house, leaving the porch empty, save for the gentle rocking of the chair and the lingering presence of a grace that defied all explanation. The ranch slept, safe under the watch of the horse that death couldn't keep, and the woman who wouldn't let him go.